Well, hello, everybody. I'm Mark Messina. My co-host is Andrea Glenn, and we have the privilege of hosting and moderating a very exciting session. It's certainly the session with the title with the best alliteration. It's the trifecta: dietary approaches for personal, public, and planetary health.
Yes, and first we have Hanna Kaliova from the US and Czech Republic, who's going to be presenting on plant-based eating in human and planetary health. Take it away.
How much plastic would you like to have in your brain? Anybody? I'm talking about enough microplastic to make up a plastic spoon. In one research study at the University of New Mexico, they analyzed 24 human brains from autopsies of deceased people, and they found that the average microplastic content was 7 grams per brain. That's about how much makes up a disposable spoon. They also found that the content of microplastics in the brain was increasing over time, and people with dementia had much more microplastics in their brain compared with people with no dementia. In this presentation, we'll explore the effects of plant-based eating on microplastics exposure and potentially also the benefits for mitigating the effects of microplastics. We will also look at the environmental impact of plant-based eating and the benefits for human health. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year took 304 patients undergoing endarterectomy, and they looked at the microplastic content in the plaque in the arteries. The average follow-up was 3 years, and the primary outcome was a composite of a heart attack, a stroke, and death from any cause. Over half of the patients had microplastics in their carotid arteries, and the researchers found that these patients had a 4.5 times higher risk of having a heart attack, a stroke, or of dying from any cause. What's the major source of microplastics in our diet? Well, you can microwave something in a plastic container that will increase the plastic exposure significantly. Plastic packaging is everywhere. But one of the major sources are the foods themselves. And with all the plastic that we throw into the oceans, it's no wonder that the microplastic content goes up in the oceans exponentially. And it's been found that fish and seafood are the richest sources in the diet. While there's a wide range of microplastic content in fish and seafood, you can consume up to 0.24 grams per 100 grams of fish of microplastics, which is about half of a plastic straw. So we not only throw all the plastic into the oceans and make the lives of the fish and all the creatures miserable, but we also consume the microplastics from seafood and fish. Just for comparison, we know that microplastics are everywhere. They're in the soil, they're in the air, so we cannot avoid microplastics completely. But just for comparison, the content of microplastics in fruits and vegetables is fairly low, only 1 to 3 particles per 100 grams. But plant-based eating can not only reduce the exposure of microplastics, some studies also suggest that plant-based eating could mitigate the effects of microplastics. In one lab experiment, they took a few samples of groundwater, which had significant amounts of microplastics. and they extracted complex carbohydrates from fenugreek and from okra. Fenugreek is an herb from the Mediterranean region. And so the complex carbohydrates from fenugreek were able, within 30 to 60 minutes, they were able to remove 89% of the microplastics. For okra, it was 80% of the microplastics removed. This was a lab experiment, so we don't know if the effects would be, the same in the human body. Some studies show that anthocyanins, which are the plant pigments in the dark red and purple fruits and vegetables, they can actually mitigate some of the effects of microplastics in the human body. It's been shown that they can attach to the sex receptors and they can prevent the microplastics from attaching to those sex hormone receptors. But plant-based eating is not only beneficial for reducing and mitigating the effects of microplastics, it has many other environmental and health benefits. Peters and colleagues estimated the amount of land that would be required to support 10 different types of diet. The American diet is all the way on the left, and that one required roughly 1 hectare or almost 3 acres of land per person per year. And then all the way on the right, there is a vegan diet, which required 8 times less. And obviously, there's a whole range of the consumption of animal products that are somewhere in between. Producing 1 kilogram of beef requires over 15,000 liters of water, whereas 1 kilogram of lentils, only 1,250 liters, which is 12 times less. Red meat, and particularly beef, has an outsized impact on greenhouse gas emissions, about 100 times more climate impact than nearly all fruits and vegetables. So how can we reduce our carbon footprint? How can we, with real meals that we eat, with what's on our plate at lunch and at dinner, what can we do for the environment and for our own health? One study analyzed vegan, vegetarian, and meat-based versions of 4 lunch dishes at a London University cafe. And they looked at the nutritional quality and the environmental impact of these meals. In all cases, the vegan meals consistently outperformed their meat-based counterparts, and the vegetarian meals were somewhere in between. In terms of nutritional quality, the vegan meals were the best. To outweigh the global warming impact of 1 portion of beef chili, one could eat a vegan chili or a bean chili for a whole month. For water use, instead of 1 portion of beef chili, one could eat vegan chili for almost 3 months. But we know that vegan meals could be beneficial for the environment. But how many of us are willing to do it for the environment? Anybody? There are a few hands. And how many of you have experienced that, you were considering a healthy meal and you looked at the menu and you just couldn't believe the price? Anybody experienced that? Yeah? Well, it's true, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be that way, right? We know that the ingredients are much cheaper for vegan meals. In this particular study, all the vegan meals were substantially lower in price compared with the meat-containing meals. We looked at this aspect in one of our randomized clinical trials, and we found that when people adopt a vegan diet, they usually save 16% on groceries on average. So that's $1.51 on average, or over $500 a year. Of course, there's a wide range of dietary patterns, and a systematic review of 14 different dietary patterns looked at how much dietary changes reduced greenhouse gas emissions, land and water use, and improved health outcomes. And while there's a huge variety based on the animal product consumption, they found that a shift to a vegan diet was associated with the biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 70 to 80%. The same magnitude of change for land use, 70 to 80% reduction with a vegan diet. And the vegan diet was also associated with the largest health benefits and a reduction in all-cause mortality by 19.2%. Kudos to Dr. Willett and the whole Eat and the Lancet Commission, who found that animal products that are highlighted in red were the biggest contributors to the environmental impact. The beef is on the top, then followed by pork, white meat, and dairy and eggs. And plant foods are highlighted in green, much lower environmental impact. And so they suggested a reference diet that Dr. Willett already described, which is very plant forward and still includes some small amounts of animal products, including fish, to ensure that we get our dose of microplastics. And they also created scoring criteria called Planetary Health Diet Index. And a recent analysis of 3 large US cohorts with over 200,000 participants showed that when comparing the highest with the lowest quintile of PHDI, all-cause mortality was 23% lower with the highest quintile. And the highest PHDI quintile was also associated with a significant reduction in the most frequent specific causes of death. It's been estimated that transitioning to a plant-based diet could cut food-related greenhouse gas emissions in half globally. But, is this estimate accurate? In order to answer that question, we decided to perform a secondary analysis from our randomized clinical trial with 244 overweight adults. They were randomly assigned to follow either a vegan diet or stay on their usual diet for 16 weeks. And big thanks to Bridget and Laura and Songhi, who blinded to the group assignment, created the whole framework for us. And they paired up each single food item on the diet records with the USDA database for greenhouse gas emissions and energy demand. So in this randomized trial, as expected, the control group didn't lose any weight. The mean weight loss was 6.4 kilograms or 14.1 pounds on the vegan diet. The greenhouse gas emissions were cut by 51% on the vegan diet. And the cumulative energy demand was reduced by 57% on the vegan diet. Interestingly, the reduction in both of these metrics also correlated significantly with weight loss. In other words, what's good for the earth is good for the animals and for people who, as a side benefit, get less microplastics on their plate. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Hannah, for that presentation. So next we have Neil Barnard from the USA, who's going to be talking about the environmental effects of food choices.
Well, thank you. When we think about our strategy to tackling with diabetes, for me, the page really turned in the 1990s. Oh, sorry. Dualities of interest. For me, the page really turned in the 1990s when researchers at Yale stuck a needle in volunteers' arms and infused lipid. And they showed that this lipid infusion would cause their insulin sensitivity to tank, not within days, but within hours. And then they found that you could do it with one single meal. And it could be a palm oil heavy meal, insulin resistance would kick in, but even up do the same thing. The buildup of fat inside cells causes insulin resistance. So our model is, if this is a muscle cell or maybe a liver cell, with a low-fat vegan diet, there's not much fat. The fat comes out of the cells and insulin resistance goes away and insulin sensitivity reasserts itself. So the glucose goes into the cell and everybody's happy. So if we look at animal products and compare them to plant products, it's obvious that there's no cholesterol in the plant products, so to speak, and there's lots in the animal products, but there's also a lot of fat, including saturated fat. People have been willing to give a pass to fish, but as you can see, it's got cholesterol, it's got saturated fat, and if we're looking for omega-3, well, 86% is not omega-3. It's MUFA and saturated fat and some PUFA, but 14% or so is give or take, is omega-3. So in the Adventist Health Study, when you look at people who don't eat any meat except for fish, that's the tan bar, well, their prevalence of diabetes is lower than an omnivore, but substantially higher than vegans. And if we could move them over toward a vegan diet, we might do better, and we might also do better when we look at BMI. The fish eaters are kind of smack in the middle. Same is true in EPIC, where whether you're looking at men or women, the fish eaters are between the omnivores and the people following an entirely plant-based diet. So the environment acts really as a motivator to push people toward a plant-based diet. And I don't need to tell you that cows belch methane, and I'm not going to say another word about it because you already know that. And I'm not going to tell you that pig farms are the most anti-environmental thing you can do to somebody you love in North Carolina. People eating those foods are not environmentalists. But it's harder for us to see under the surface of the ocean. And what about those animals? And what does fishing do for the environment? So let me just walk through that a little bit. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN has shown us how fishing is exploding. About half of it is wild capture, and the other half is farmed fish. And farmed fish have recently overtaken wild-caught fish for the amount of production. But how do they get to the plate? The most common form of wild catch fishing, catching fish in the wild, is bottom trawling. The second most common is with a purse seine net, where the school of tuna is in a circumscribed area, and with a drawstring purse, you yank them all out of the ocean. Are there environmental effects of this? Well, bottom trawling, as I said, is the most popular form of catching fish in the wild, and you take a huge net that scrapes the bottom floor, and you just bring up anybody and anything that's there, including all the fish you didn't really want. Most of the fish you trap are not the target species, they are trash. The ocean floor is an ecosystem of its own, with coral and plants and animals that live there. And the bottom trawler comes in like a bulldozer that rips up everything. And it's banned in the European Union below 800 meters and in certain vulnerable areas, but it remains the most popular system worldwide. But it's sustainable. Is it? Well, it takes between 2 and 6 years for that area to eventually recover. And it reminds me, whenever I hear the sustainability, I remember where I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, hiding under a table in the basement with my parents and my siblings, because that was on the edge of town. And several hours later, we came up to ground level and found that parts of our town looked like that. And if someone were to say, well, we could replace the people who are killed and injured, and we can replace those buildings, you might want to say something like that, but that doesn't mean that replacing them doesn't undo the damage. And the same is true when you destroy the life forms and so forth that are under the ocean floor. So skipping fish protects the seabed. But what about the ocean itself? Between California and Hawaii and further west, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is a huge floating sea of junk, including plastic, and 46% of it comes from fishing nets. Fishing nets are not made of hemp and cotton. They are made from polyethylene and polypropylene. It's light, it's durable, and it degrades under the effects of ultraviolet light and abrasion, and it's used in fishing gear. So you'll see fish netting that is degraded and is discarded, but more than that, as it's used in this, say, in this purse seine net, it comes apart and releases microplastics wherever these ships go. So we had wondered, well, okay, let's say I round up the microplastics in the water in my lake or my river or this chunk of ocean. If they're fibrous fragments, we're going to assume that comes from fishing rope and nets. And if it's little amorphous chunks, I'm going to assume that came from a plastic bottle or a plastic sack. But Imogen Napper at the University of Plymouth actually did a test where on a fishing vessel on the left and in her laboratory on the right, she used fishing rope and ran it through a typical pulley system to catch the microplastics as they floated off in the process of ordinary use. And what she found is that they are not little fibrous strands, they're irregular strands. And so what we had thought was garbage coming from land was actually in many cases coming from the fishing industry itself. And killjoy that she is, she wanted to quantify how much is actually there. She took 50 meters of rope, hauled it one time through a pulley system, and found that about up to 2,000 particles of microplastic come off from ordinary use. That's if it's brand new rope. If it's about 2 years old or older, it's up to 38,000 particles emitted from one single use. Now, she then calculated 4,500 fishing vessels working maybe 100 days a year. That's between 326 million and 17 billion microplastic pieces coming from ordinary use, not discarding anything. It's like the waiter coming to your table and saying, would you like a little Parmesan on your salad? And this flurry of junk gets on your plate. Are we swallowing it? Well, as Dr. Kaliova said, sure we are, but the amount varies hugely based on the study you look at, from a low to maybe 500 microplastic particles per year for people who are just not eating those things, to up to maybe 11,000 particles for people who are eating filter feeding fish and small fish. Is it harmful to human health? The things that are really hypothesized are neurotoxicity and immunosuppression and cancer, and Dr. Kaliova mentioned cardiovascular disease as well. But I have to say, as I read the literature, it's impossible to really make sense of it. I think it's anybody's guess. It's probably worst with fish that are eaten whole, like a sardine, where whatever is in their intestinal tract, you're going to swallow all those microplastics. Filter feeders and animals who eat filter feeders as well. The point is, commercial fishing is a major source of microplastics. So let's go and look at the fish farm. Fish farming is exploding and different systems are used in different parts of the world, but there is pollution from uneaten food. Fish on fish farms are fed other fish, the remains of fish, and much of it they don't eat. And so it drifts along with feces from the fish that are there and the chemicals that are in the feces and the drugs that are used to try to contain diseases in your fish farm, which are considerable. A fish farm looks like any factory farm. These are salmon. And in the wild, they might get an occasional sea louse on their surface. But if you farm them together, the sea lice are endemic. And they drill right into the fish's skin, and they are sometimes fatal. So they're treated with drugs to which the sea lice develop resistance, and to which they pass to other sea lice. And it's exactly like any other factory farm, whether it's chickens or pigs or whatever. You've got exactly the same kinds of problems of overcrowding and so forth. Okay, the last thing just to talk about, the human eye has photoreceptors for red and green and blue. You can see the whole visible spectrum, and it's an amazing thing. But the pigeon has you beat. The pigeon can see all of those that you can see plus ultraviolet. But the shrimp can see everything you can see and everything the pigeon can see plus could deal with polarization. Why? Because they're way below at the bottom of the sea, and it's difficult to see everything that's there. So they need a much more sophisticated eye than you have. They have single eye depth perception and can move their two eyes individually. So for anyone who imagined that a celestial being had made all the other animals as sort of rough drafts for the perfection that is humanity, I got to tell you, you got nothing on a shrimp. And for those who thought mainframe computers are great because they're so big, well, microchips were a whole lot better. And so the fact that a shrimp is very compact does not mean that their eyes are somehow not miraculous. And scientists have looked closely at those eyes, and they found something else, even more amazing, that the fisheye on its stalk has an X-organ sinus gland that releases gonad inhibiting hormone when factors are not propitious for maturation. And it stops ovarian maturation. Wouldn't it be great if humans had something like that to tell us maybe now is not the right time? Anyhow, but shrimp do have that. And in the conditions of a fish farm, they do not breed. So fish farmers have a solution. It's a razor blade. You cut the shrimp's eyes off. And the FAO shows us just how to do it. This is from the United Nations. It's called eye ablation, and this is absolutely routine. You take your razor blade, or you can use a small string. You cut through the stalk, or you just cut into the eye, and then you squeeze it out with your fingers. Okay, well, I'll put up with all of this because I want my protein from salmon. Well, our good friends at Harvard did a wonderful study that suggested if I'm eating meat, and I substitute plant protein for the animal protein, mortality within any given time frame is reduced. And the same is true if I'm eating fish and instead of the fish, I substitute plant protein, I'm going to do better. Mortality goes down. Now, this vegetarian animal, if killed for your dinner, will still give you things that you don't want, like cholesterol and saturated fat and animal protein. Carnivores. So that means, like these sockeye salmon, the bigger they are, the more they have accumulated, not just cholesterol and saturated fat and animal protein, but heavy metals and PCBs and dioxins. So you say, well, forget all of that. All I want is the omega-3. Well, you can go to the store and you could get a bottle of fish oil without all that stuff in it. But wait. Somebody reminds you that fish didn't make that omega-3 anyway. They just ate it in the form of algae and they stored it in their tissue. So forget that. I can just have algae-derived omega-3 and I'm perfectly happy. So to save the environment, I can wait and think about what I might do someday. Or I could stop using plastic straws. Or maybe I could think about the ocean, think about who's in there, and the wonder that they have, and just leave them off the plate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. So now we have our last speaker of the session. We have Vasanti Malik from Canada, who'll be presenting integrating health, nutrition, and environmental impacts of foods.
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm excited to share some works in progress. This is a new direction for our lab. Here we go. Some disclosures from the past few years, committees I've been on, funding support, and travel honoraria. So it has been well established that diet has a profound impact on health. We all know that, all of us in this room. This is data from the Global Burden of Disease showing the proportion of deaths in Canada attributable to poor diet quality. And this is a similar case globally. And so in addition to the profound impact on health, we know that diets and the food systems driving those diets can have a profound impact on the environment. We've heard that from our speakers just before me. We know that our food systems are a major contributor to global climate change. Agricultural production and processing is highly water intensive and is responsible for about 70% of human use of fresh water. We know that agriculture is responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions. 33% of waste, 66% biodiversity loss, 33% degraded soils, and 40% of land use. And so if we consider the planetary boundaries framework that's shown here, we find ourselves in the situation where 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been crossed. And for those who are not familiar with this framework, the planetary boundaries is describing 9 key processes that are critical for maintaining stability and resilience of the Earth system, and it's heavily influenced by human activity. These planetary boundaries align with targets for sustainable food production according to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so almost half of global food production is really depending on crossing these boundaries. In Canada, the diet exceeds planetary boundaries. The impacts exceed 100% of the boundary, which is shown there in the black dashed line, largely driven by ruminant meat, so beef and lamb. And so national dietary guidelines have the potential to be an important tool in helping shifting dietary habits of a population. And so a meta-analysis was done a few years ago, and it showed about out of 95 food-based dietary guidelines, 29 had environmental sustainability messaging. And so this is progress, right? Environmental sustainability messaging in those national dietary guidelines. However, this meta-analysis also pointed out that much of that messaging is hidden to consumers, and it's missing practical advice. And so in addition to those limitations, there are also important gaps in environmental impact data that support our dietary recommendations. So for example, we don't have good quality environmental impact data for a number of foods in the food supply. Much of the environmental impacts do not assess the entire cycle of a food. So maybe they stop at the farm gate. So we're not getting that ability to appreciate the impact across the entire life cycle of a food. And some of the data also focus on 1 or 2 impacts. So greenhouse gas, for example, but there are important trade-offs between impacts that we need to think about. We also need to consider regional contexts and agroclimatic conditions. So if we want to look at the impact of diet on environmental impacts in Canada, can we borrow environmental impact data from Europe or Australia? Probably not, because those electricity grids and other things are quite different. So we really need to do this locally. And we also need to consider nutrition. So the integration of environmental and nutritional considerations, we're interested in both dimensions of the diet. And so to address this, we embarked upon quite an ambitious project to build a database of environmental impacts of foods consumed in Canada. And so also create a composite food score that combines both environmental impact and nutritional quality, because as I mentioned, we're interested in both dimensions of foods. And this work is really being done by Sarah Jarvis, a PhD student working with me. And so I'm going to give a high-level overview of the life cycle assessment, which is what we're doing to generate these data. And so life cycle assessment is a multi-step process for calculating the lifetime environmental impact of a product. And we're doing this according to the International Organization for Standardization, ISO standards for LCA. And so the system boundary for our LCAs start from the raw materials, so the raw products, right up into consumer use. So we're across the entire food life cycle of the food. Our data reflects average foods consumed in Canada with weighted impacts for imports utilizing FAO data. And our data reflects current practices wherever available. And so this is just sort of showing a little bit more detail of what's going on across these different stages of the food life cycle and what we're considering in our LCA analyses. We also considered transportation across each stage by modeling mass changes, distance traveled, and modality. And so this is quite a complex procedure, and we're using data from a lot of different sources. We have background data sets for transportation, packaging, and electricity coming from EcoInvent and Data Smart. We're getting LCI data from a number of existing databases, and we're building this database with the foods to correspond to those foods in the Canadian nutrient file. So we'll be able to look at changes in diet with respect to those foods in the Canadian nutrient supply, so about 7,000 foods, but we're also considering foods that are not in the Canadian nutrient file that reflect new food items in the food supply. And so the steps we're going through, we first start off with creating our LCI, our life cycle inventory, which considers all of the inputs and outputs of a food across the food supply chain. And then we classify all of those inputs and outputs across 4 main impact categories that we're interested in of policy importance. So greenhouse gas emissions, marine eutrophication, land use and water use. And then we do some mathematical characterization and normalization processes, and we come with our environmental impact score. And these analyses are done in CIMAPRO, which is a software for LCA. And so for our environmental impact score, this is really how we're translating our impact into sort of usable data. And so we're creating individual environmental impact scores for each food, and then a composite score that combines the 4 impacts I just mentioned with specific weights for each food. And so we have our raw environmental impact score, which are normalized and normalized impacts. Normalized impacts are unitless so that we can compare them for each category and for our composite score. We also have our EIS 100. And so this is when we take normalized values, our impact 100, and the food with the greatest raw score in that impact category is used to set the reference value for a score of 100. So kind of along the lines of a glycemic index. And then we have our EIS grade. So in here we are assigning each food to further simplify the communication of impacts to streamline decision making. So we're taking our EIS 100 and then we're assigning it a grade for this is really for public health translation. Just a few words about our composite score. This question comes up sometimes about our weighting. So we're using weighting factors that are recommended, that are adapted from the literature. And so these are our raw scores we take from the 4 normalized impacts and we weight them and sum them. And then we take that raw score, that composite score, and transform it again to be a scaled score out of 100. And so those are our environmental impact scores. And so we're interested also, as I mentioned, is integrating nutritional quality. So now we also have an EIS nutrition. And so this is a composite. This is where we take environmental impact score and Nutri-Score. And so this is the ratio of our environmental impact score, Nutri-Score, which is Nutri-Score is a validated nutrient profiling model that includes foods to encourage and foods to discourage. And Nutri-Score is used to support labeling activities in Europe, in France, and other countries in Europe. And so that's our EIS nutrition. And so now on to some results. Again, these are preliminary data. They have not been published yet. And so we're just going to do a little comparison of ground beef to ground soy. And this is, here we go. Oh. And so this is comparing normalized impact, so 1 kilogram of ground beef versus ground soy. And we can see that ground beef, 22 times higher greenhouse gas emissions, 33 times higher marine eutrophication, 39 times higher land use, and 5 times higher water use. We also express our results using the planetary boundaries framework. So this is, remember, the % of daily boundary per serving is how we're expressing these data. And so from previous publications, the planetary boundary for food, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and water use has already been established, as well as per capita boundary per person per day. So we've taken that and we're applying it to these data. So we can see for ground beef compared to ground soy, we're utilizing much more of our daily daily boundary per serving. And so we also look at our environmental impacts of different food. This is a selection of different food items from our database, looking at land use, water use, eutrophication, and greenhouse gas emissions, so our 4 impacts of interest. And we can see the greatest environmental impacts are generally for animal-based products, particularly beef, so consistent with the literature. And this is being expressed here in environmental impacts per 100 grams. But importantly, when we change our unit and we move on to environmental impacts modeled per serving, we can see that the comparison and general trend between animal and plant-based foods becomes more pronounced. And so now this is data looking at nutritional quality, Nutri-Score on the x-axis, and environmental impact composite score on the y-axis. So we're here looking at sort of our joint impact of nutritional quality and environmental impact. And we see foods with greater nutritional quality generally demonstrate lower environmental impact, consistent with the literature. And so now we also have used our data to do some diet comparisons. So this is a dietary comparison of the portfolio diet and the typical Canadian diet. And this was using 3-day menu compositions by food 3-day diet menus. And you can see here the food composition by category that's shown comparing portfolio diet to a typical Canadian diet. And this is just showing 3-day menu data. So these are isocaloric, 2,000 calories per day. And these are the reference menus for the typical Canadian diet is derived from usual dietary intake data from the Canadian Community Health Survey. And the portfolio diet data came from compliments of Gabby Viscardi, a PhD student working in our department with myself and Laura. And so now comparing portfolio diet to the typical Canadian diet, this is looking at impacts by meals, and we're seeing the normalized impacts for the 3-day menu average. And we can see, we can really, when we look across, and so the heat map, so highest impacts are shown in red, lower impact in the green, and we can see, you know, a typical Canadian diet, particularly lunch and dinner, are where we're finding the highest impacts. And that's not so surprising because those are the meals that were containing meat, red meat. And so we also can do our comparison of portfolio diet and typical Canadian diet, looking at, you know, reductions. We can see portfolio diet was linked to 3.8 times reductions in climate change, more greenhouse gas, 1.5 in water use, 3.2 in land use, and 2.1 times lower marine eutrophication. We can also look at this according to our planetary planetary boundary framework, and we can see the typical Canadian diet is just really, you know, pushing past those planetary boundaries compared to the portfolio diet was really largely in our safe operating space. Oh, and so quickly our EIS 100, just to show what some of this data might look like. This is our sort of our scoring for our composite score. For an example, for ground beef, we can see we get an EIS score of 65, which corresponds to being very high with respect to our environmental grades that we've created. These are using relative grade boundaries. So these are scores for each grade relative to scores of other products in the database. And I mentioned the grade boundaries change as products are added as our database grows. So this is our relative and variable grade boundary. And then here now we've taken our scores and we've superimposed them with Nutri-Score. So we've combined them. And so this is just an example of 6 foods to show. We can see Nutri-Score shown with the, on the top there with for example, raw spinach, canned tomatoes, avocado, all have a Nutri-Score of A being, a healthful choice. And then we can look at our environmental scores, which are in the middle of the dial there, raw spinach getting a very good score, meaning an environmentally protective product or a product to choose that supports environmental impact. Canned tomatoes, avocado, less so. And then we can see our animal-based products on the bottom there with ground beef getting our lowest environmental impact score, meaning worse for the environment. So our results demonstrate foods and diets with higher nutritional quality are generally more environmentally sustainable with some exceptions, and this is in accordance with current literature. This is our comprehensive database, and our scores can be potential tools for researchers, policymakers, and consumers that can help support sustainability goals and dietary recommendations, as well as inform and advance new policies, and hopefully spark some collaborations with researchers, policymakers, and industry, and other organizations interested in diets and environmental sustainability. Now, as I mentioned, this is a work in progress. So our next steps, immediate next steps, are doing some validation work. We're continuing estimating environmental impacts of different diets. We're also assigning our environmental impacts to Mary Labbé's FLIP database, so we can look at changes in environmental impacts of the food supply, and that's with a collaboration with the Data Science Institute at U of T, whereas we're going to be doing some machine learning there. And hopefully the ultimate goal is to really take this data and create an interactive dashboard that will be a resource for the community. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Vasanti. So